Epilogue. In the Mission, Kelowna, BC. Sunday afternoon, on the same day she closed her last case. Mac got a hold of Penny over the phone to give her the official account, and she returned home from visiting a friend in Vernon. As soon as she hit town, she walked to Doreen's place. When Doreen opened her front door, Penny threw her arms around her. "Thank you so much," she cried out and hugged her again. After a moment she stepped back and said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to run out on you. But I didn't know what that horrible man meant to do. I couldn't stick around long enough to find out." "It's okay," Doreen said. "He can't hurt you again." Needing to walk and talk, both of them still too keyed up to just sit inside, they walked along Doreen's backyard as Doreen gave Penny all the details. When their questions and answers ran out, Penny noticed the large garden beds along the side fence. "This is going to be lovely," she said, motioning to a long stretch of Doreen's overgrown garden. "I've got a long way to go to get it back to what it was," Doreen said. "It's a lot of work." "Understood. It's the same at my place," Penny said. "And not sure I want to now. Before Johnny disappeared, I loved gardening. Then it became a way to wear off the worry and tension over the years, but after George's death, I'd leave it as is," Doreen said. "You're selling, and your yard doesn't look too bad. And yet selling the house feels like a betrayal to George." Doreen looked at Penny. "Were you happy with George?" Penny beamed. "Very happy with him. He was a good provider, a good man." Doreen didn't know if she should ask about George's death. It was an uncomfortable topic. Just because Hornby had made some accusations, that didn't mean it wasn't true, but also didn't mean Hornby wasn't just causing trouble. "How did George die again?" "A heart attack," Penny said, her face stilling. She put a hand to her heart. "He went very quickly." Penny walked toward the rear of the property, where a large bunch of echinacea stood tall. The blooms hadn't opened yet, but it looked to explode with flowers soon. "I'm sorry for your loss," Doreen said. "That must have been very difficult." "Oh, it was," she said. "It was, indeed." Doreen looked at the low patch of echinacea in her garden and smiled. "I remember how your plants are much bigger than mine." She motioned at her poor echinacea, adding, "I have all kinds of other plants crowding mine, as well as more plants I need to move like foxglove, belladonna, nightshade." She slid her glance sideways, checking Penny's reaction to her list of poisonous plants, but saw absolutely nothing. Satisfied, Doreen linked her arm with Penny's and faced her new gardening friend. "I wanted to give you more of the news personally, before you heard it elsewhere." "Thank you for that," Penny said. "I should get home now." She looked back at Doreen's gardens as they walked toward the creek. "You know what? Considering we found the dagger in the Dahlias at my place and then that medallion out in my front yard too, I won't ever look at a big clump of plants like that without wondering if more evidence is hiding in it." Doreen's mind kicked in, repeating evidence in the echinacea. Evidence in the echinacea. But that was not today's story. That would have to wait for another day. With a smile she said, "Forget all about that for now," she said. "We can garden another day." Penny chuckled. "Sounds good to me. At least we have something in common." Doreen nodded. "We do indeed. We plant things, all kinds of seeds, even ideas we weren't aware we were planting." Her tone was cryptic. Penny looked at her sideways, but Doreen just smiled and suggested, "Maybe you should set up a memorial garden for Johnny now." At Penny's startled look, Doreen explained further. "I know that came out of the blue. But I was thinking, as I looked at that echinacea, how you have lost both Johnny and George, and both of them loved your home." "But I'm selling it," Penny said. "Remember that?" Doreen nodded. "Maybe that's a nice way to leave it then, as the home you all shared together," she said. "Creating a memorial garden before you move out would be a very nice thing to do for them." If the new owners rip it out, well, all fair and good. You wouldn't have to do much. Just set up 2 rings of rocks and a little marker stone in the center of each ring, and say some kind words over it. You'll get Johnny's medallion and his knife back at some point in time from the police. There is that little cross as well. Penny looked thoughtful as she stared at the creek. You're thinking about me getting closure, aren't you? I am, Doreen said, but she was also thinking of something else that just wouldn't leave her alone. For your own sake. Plus, you don't know how long it'll take to sell your house, she said. But if you think about it, it could be a few months or even a year. You haven't put it on the market yet, have you? Penny shook her head. I couldn't while you were investigating, she said starkly. It seemed wrong to. Now that you're done, and we know what happened. She shook her head. George spent most of his adult life searching for his brother, and to think that he never found out, but in just a few days, look what you accomplished. I'm really sorry about the long passage of time without answers, Doreen said, her voice compassionate. I think one of the hardest things for people is to never find out the truth. And you did it so fast, Penny said in amazement. That's what really blows me away. I only talked to you last Tuesday, Wednesday. And then, all of a sudden, it's Sunday, and here you are already with it solved. Doreen didn't know what to say. While she formulated an answer, Penny burst out, why couldn't the police have done that years ago? Because years ago, people stayed mum for a lot of different reasons. Things were different back then. People kept secrets, likely out of fear, Doreen said slowly, thinking about what it had taken for the answers to come to the surface. And I think Hornby stayed low and out of trouble until he left town as soon as he could. Now so much time has passed, he thought he was safe. Penny said, it makes no sense. He killed all 3 of those boys for nothing. Yes, Doreen said, speaking slowly. It also helped Hornby keep his secret when Susan couldn't remember anything from the car accident. She was under the influence of the drugs and still hungover, so it's no wonder the cops didn't take her seriously. Yet she's the one who kept saying a multicolored vehicle was involved, whereas Alan said it happened so fast that he couldn't remember anything other than a small car. Black, he thought, but he wasn't even sure of that. Could have been dark green or dark blue. Apparently, he'd been fighting with Susan. And of course it was all make-believe anyway, Penny whispered. It's just too incredible. It is, Doreen said, but honestly, often the truth is the simplest answer of all. They had found no DNA back then that led to any suspects. They had no digital anything back then, Penny said, like to see if Johnny showed up in another county or whatever. Doreen nodded. And, of course, Alan's father stuck up for him and gave him an alibi. Mr. Hornby believed his son was at home and didn't see the body in the trash truck's compactor. Julie's family wasn't any better. Nobody wanted to point the finger at Alan Hornby, even though nobody liked him. Even Julie had no way of knowing that an argument or picking one man over another would cause this kind of a reaction. But to think it was love triangle gone wrong, Penny said in bewilderment. And for all of it to stay a secret over all these years. We didn't even know about Julie. But Mother Earth gives up her secrets eventually, Doreen said. Think about the dagger. Think about the medallion. Think about the cross. There's no chance of Johnny's body being found, is there? No, I doubt it, Doreen said softly but firmly. I'm afraid that idea has to be set aside. He was placed in the old landfill. Everything there was all mulched together and reclaimed, as the city does its job, and now a whole new subdivision has been built up there. I think the community of Wilden is there now. Penny looked at her. All those new fancy big houses in Glenmore? I think so, Doreen said. If not that area, another one nearby. She watched her friend, still trying to take it all in, to make peace with it. Come on. You're a bit shaken up. I need a walk anyway. Let's get you home. It'll be dark soon. Are you sure? Penny asked, but she looked grateful nonetheless. I have to admit that I'm feeling pretty shaky. Knowing that it's over, that all this which haunted us, which haunted almost my entire marriage, is over. Now if only you had moved to Kelowna years ago, she joked, then George would have known what happened before he died. The thing is, back then, I probably wouldn't have been doing what I'm doing now anyway. Why is that? Because I'm a different person from who I was even a few years ago, Doreen said with half a smile. She called for Muggs. Muggs, you want to go for a walk? Immediately her basset hound, who'd long lost his pedigree and his good manners, appeared, jumped up, and twirled around on his back legs. She giggled. Now if only we could make money with a circus act, she said. She bent down, gave him a quick hug, then pulled his leash from her back pocket to hook it on. You don't normally put him on the leash, do you? Penny asked. No, she said. Not since I moved here, but he is leash trained. I just figured that, every once in a while, I should do it to keep him in the habit. At that, they stepped out on the creek pathway, and a streak of orange bolted toward them. Goliath, want to go for a walk? From the veranda at the back of her house, Doreen could hear Thaddeus calling out, wait for me, wait for me. Doreen chuckled. I guess Thaddeus wants to come too. Penny was fascinated as Doreen squatted down, waiting for the bird to waddle to them. She stretched out her arm and Thaddeus hopped onto the back of her hand and sidestepped all the way up to her shoulder. Once there, he brushed his beak against her cheek. She reached out and gently stroked his back. I wouldn't go without you, big guy. As if he understood, he nudged her a couple more times and then settled in. Just as she was about to take a step, he said, giddy up, giddy up. Instantly she froze, turned her head to look at him, and said, no way am I following your commands. He twisted his head, looked at her, batted those huge eyes of his, and said, Thaddeus, go. Yes, she said in exasperation. You can tell that you'll be going somewhere, she said. You're already on my shoulder, and we're already out of the house. And then he seemed to settle without more arguments. As she glanced at Penny, her new friend tried to hold back her chuckles. She rolled her eyes at Penny. It's pretty bad when the bird treats me like some sort of an old gray mare, she snapped. Oh wait. She returned to her house, reset the alarms on the front and back doors, and then rejoined her animals and Penny. Now let's go for a walk. I heard the beeps. Penny glanced back at the house. Do you always set an alarm when you go for a walk? You don't look like the type to me. Normally I wouldn't be, Doreen said cheerfully. But I have an antiques dealer coming tomorrow to look at a few pieces, she said, carefully fudging the truth. I would hate for anybody to go inside and help themselves. Penny nodded. Oh my no, she said. When I think of all the hours George and Nan spent arguing about her antiques. Why arguing? Doreen asked. Because George thought she should sell them, and Nan said she had another plan in mind. Doreen's heart warmed when she thought about Nan's other plan. Yes, Nan was holding on to them for me, Doreen said with a wistful smile. My grandmother is pretty special. Oh, she's special all right, Penny said, chuckling. George used to come home from one of his visits, and although he'd be brighter and full of laughter, he'd say that Nan was especially crazy. A lot of people have told me that she fell somewhere in that realm, Doreen said. I am afraid she's losing some of her memory now, though. She's probably not taking all those supplements George told her to take. They worked like a charm for her. What kind of supplements? Penny shrugged. I'll have to take a look, she said. I have the notes at home somewhere. George always had a fascination for natural remedies. Nan was having trouble even back then. And they helped her? Penny nodded emphatically. Oh yes. George used to comment on it all the time. Well, if you could get me that list, that would be awesome, Doreen said. I have absolutely no idea about supplements. And I really don't like doctors. No, once you deal with something like George's heart condition, Penny said, you have to consider how much the medical profession actually knows. Obviously they're helpful a lot of the time, but some of the time it makes you wonder if they aren't just pushing drugs. Exactly, Doreen said. But if you had supplements that worked instead, that would be huge. I think it's the same list he gave me, so I can certainly find out when I get a moment, Penny said. Do you think Nan would take them? Doreen nodded. Particularly if I say it was the same stuff that George used to give her. That might work too, Penny said. Those two really did get along like a house on fire. Nan was pretty upset at George's funeral. I'm sure she was, Doreen said. I think one of the hardest things about getting old is watching all your friends die before you. Very true, Penny said. As they walked up to Penny's house a good half-hour later, Penny motioned and said, If you want to come in for a few minutes, I can look for that list. Doreen brightened. She'd been looking for an excuse as it was to go inside and see how Penny lived. So far she'd only been invited into a few houses, Nan's, Julie's and Doreen's murderous neighbor, Ella. Doreen nodded and said, Sure. Thank you very much. Together, the five of them trooped into Penny's home. Inside Penny's house, Doreen looked around. It was stuffed with pretty floral-patterned couches, large floral paintings and yes, floral carpets. It was also pristine. You haven't started packing, have you? Well, it's not like I've sold my house yet, Penny said in a dry tone. As Doreen looked at Penny's big living room, it wasn't really cluttered, but it was overstuffed with mementos. If you got a staging crew or a realtor in here, she said, I'm pretty sure they'll insist on all the pictures coming off the walls, all the stuff being moved off the countertops, hauling out the big hutches you've got. Realtors can be quite brutal. Penny's jaw dropped. You know what? I was thinking about bringing in a stager to see what they'd charge me. But it sounds like you know a lot about it. Not necessarily, she said, but I've watched lots of shows on TV. And my husband did a lot of buying and selling. Right, Penny said. Doreen could almost see that in Penny's mind, those disqualifiers just raised Doreen's status several notches. Doreen didn't understand how that worked because, of course, people should be doing their own investigation and research on this type of thing before deciding. Besides, in Doreen's mind, she should be demoted, not promoted for her husband's activities. Have you picked out a realtor? Absolutely. I was going to ask Simi Giron, she said. I've known that family for 30 years or more. Oh good, she said, that should make it easier. Ask her about staging and decluttering when she's here. Well, she's already been here once, but we haven't signed any paperwork yet. That's when the boom will get lowered, Doreen said, chuckling. I hope not, Penny said, walking into her kitchen, approaching a large cupboard, opened it up. She took out a small notebook sitting on top of the box of vitamin bottles and brought it to the kitchen table and sat down, flipping through the pages. Ah, here it is, she said, a page just for Nan. She held it up and then read from it. Vitamin D, ginkgo, B12, and I'm not sure what this other one says. Do you mind if I take a look? Doreen asked, holding out her hand. Penny handed it over. As Doreen looked at it, she said, I'm not sure what that is either. May I get a copy of this? We'll photocopy both sides. Passing the book back, Penny made copies of both sides and then gave Doreen the 2 sheets. Thanks. Penny nodded with a smile, and both women returned to the kitchen, where Penny tucked the book back into the vitamin corner. Must have been nice that George was so interested in health, she said. A lot of good it did him, Penny said bitterly, and she winced. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I guess you're angry he died, huh? Isn't that the stupidest thing? Penny asked. Even after a year, I still look around our house and I get mad at him. We had all these plans for retirement, all these things we would do now that he wasn't working anymore. And here he ups and dies on me. Well, can't you do those things on your own? I could, Penny said, but I don't really want to. They were things we would do together. They were our plans. Versus your plans? Penny froze for a moment and slowly nodded. Very insightful. She glanced at her watch and said, "Oh my goodness. I have to run. I have to meet someone." "Oh, absolutely no problem," Doreen said. "We'll go and let you get on then." She and her animals were ushered to the front door. Goliath had taken up a seat in the middle of George's big recliner. Doreen scooped him into her arms with Thaddeus still on her shoulder, and Muggs trotted behind them. "It was a nice visit," she said, "and I'm glad I had good news for you." As she stepped down the front steps, Penny said, "And once again thank you," she said sincerely. "I will definitely sleep better now." With a half wave, Doreen watched as Penny got into her vehicle and reversed out of her driveway and headed down the street. But Doreen had stopped on Penny's driveway. Doreen really shouldn't do what she was thinking of doing. But it was pretty damn hard to talk herself out of it. With a shrug, she decided it would worry away at her, so she might as well put her mind to rest. She put Goliath down, Thaddeus taking the opportunity to get down as well, and quickly headed into Penny's backyard, where Johnny had his favorite place to sit. Doreen didn't even know why Penny's echinacea bed was bugging her, but she thought she'd read somewhere how echinacea was used in all kinds of medicine. It certainly wasn't, as far as she knew, a killer, but anything was a killer if you took too much of it. Doreen made a quick trip through Penny's backyard, mentally jotting down what was here: marigolds, lilies, calla lilies, black-eyed Susans. None were flowering yet. Daisies were about to explode with blooms. This would be a lively garden when summer hit. She really appreciated the wide variety, even a few straggling tulips. She stopped and stared at them and shook her head. "What are you guys doing drooping over like that?" She stopped to study stalks reaching for the sky. They wouldn't bloom for another month or two, and this bed was far too crowded for them to do well. Then there was the belladonna and foxglove mingling in the patch too. Drat. So was their presence that bad? She couldn't tell. But as the same poisonous plants lived in Nan's garden. Possibly Nan and George had shared a love of poisonous plants as well as antiques. Glancing around, Doreen noted how little shade the echinacea plants would probably get during the daylight hours, backed up against the fence as they were, which wouldn't help their growth. As she dropped down in front of the massive green patch, at least 3 feet across with dozens of plants in there, she frowned, realizing their roots would be completely twisted together. Echinacea plants loved company, particularly its own family, but at one point in time, they would fight and hate each other, just like every other family. Too close confines caused too much strife. She checked the ground around the roots, unable to help herself, and realized they were also very dry. The ground was poor here, with many rocks noticeable in the soil. Echinacea could survive in crappy soil. A lot of plants could survive. But the intention of a garden was not to have them survive, it was to have the flowers thrive. And again, as she glanced around the backyard, what had once been Penny's pride and joy at this point in time was probably just a constant source of work and bad memories. As Doreen walked past the echinacea, she thought she saw something else burrowed in the center of one of the plants. But just then, a man asked from the park side of the fence, "Hey, what are you doing back there?" She popped out of Penny's backyard gate guiltily, leaving the gate open for her animals, and plastered a bright smile on her face. "I walked home with Penny," she said, but she had to take off. "I just wanted to take a quick look at her garden. She has done so well here," she said, injecting a bright warmth to her voice. The man looked at her suspiciously. She looked him over, from the top of his 6-foot frame to his dirty sneakers, and held out a hand. "I'm Doreen Montgomery, and who are you?" Reluctantly, he shook her hand. "I'm Steve." Steve? His frown deepened. Just Steve. She nodded and smiled and said, "Well, if you see Penny and you want to tell her how I was in her backyard, that's fine," she said. "She knows that I'm a crazy gardener too. I was checking out her echinacea." "Echinacea?" he asked doubtfully, looking at the green splotch against the fence. "Echinacea," she said firmly. "We were talking about mine at my house earlier." At that, his face seemed to settle and his shoulders sagged as if with relief. "Not to worry," she said. "I'm not a thief. I'm the one who helped solve Johnny's disappearance." At that, awareness came into Steve's eyes. Of course, Muggs's slow approach, his head lowered and moving from side to side like a pissed-off bull, drew more attention to Doreen. So did the orange streak that raced between Steve's legs, and he grinned. "Now I know who you are." Thaddeus, not to be outdone, squawked, "No you don't." "No you don't." "Yeah, sorry about them," she said. She gave Steve a quick finger wave. "And now I'll head home before my critters decide that they like Penny's garden better than mine," she said in a joking manner. Steve watched as she and her animals ambled toward the creek. "Why are you walking along the creek?" he asked, calling behind her. "Because I love it," she said. "It's my favorite place to walk." He shrugged and said, "Nothing but dirty water down there. It's full of ducks and all kinds of waterfowl. Hopefully I'll see some today." "You won't catch me walking through the water, that's their toilet." And with that, he headed off. She walked a few more steps and turned to look back. He strode away, not having explained his presence at Penny's property. Doreen frowned and thought about that, then sent Penny a quick text. "Stop to take a quick look at your echinacea plants." A stranger named Steve came up and didn't seem terribly friendly. "Wasn't sure what he was doing in the park behind your place. Just a heads up." And she left it at that. "Come on, Goliath, Muggs." Thaddeus squawked as he waddled toward her, but then Muggs came racing forward with Goliath on his heels, and in a surprisingly quick move, Thaddeus jumped on Muggs, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Giddy up, Muggs! Giddy up, Muggs!" By the time Doreen had crossed the bridge and headed up her backyard, Thaddeus had long given up riding Muggs, subsequently walking. Now he was tucked into the crook of her neck, swaying with her every step. She crossed the bridge as her phone beeped with a return text. "He's a lovely neighbor, but he doesn't like strangers. That echinacea is doing terrible. As are some of my more specialized plants. Suggestions?" Doreen grinned. "Perfect entrance to find out more." "Absolutely. Maybe we'll have tea another day and check it out." "Perfect."